The obsession with an avoidant who has caused significant emotional harm isn't a sign of true love or deep connection. It's a psychological trap created by the perfect storm of intermittent reinforcement, unresolved attachment wounds, and the human brain's addiction to uncertainty and challenge. Understanding why this obsession persists, despite obvious incompatibility and repeated hurt, requires examining the complex psychological mechanisms that make emotionally unavailable people seem more desirable than those who offer consistent love and support. This obsession often masquerades as romantic devotion while actually representing a form of psychological self-harm that prevents authentic healing and healthy relationship formation. The avoidant who hurts someone doesn't become obsession-worthy because of their positive qualities or relationship potential, but because their inconsistent behavior triggers deep psychological patterns that create artificial intensity and perceived significance. The intermittent reinforcement schedule they provide, moments of connection followed by withdrawal, expressions of care followed by rejection, intimacy followed by distance, creates the same addictive response pattern found in gambling, substance abuse, and other compulsive behaviors. The unpredictability of their emotional availability makes their attention feel more valuable when it's received and more desperately needed when it's withdrawn. This obsession reveals more about the obsessed person's psychological wounds and unmet needs than it does about the avoidant's actual desirability or compatibility as a partner. The avoidant becomes a screen onto which unresolved attachment trauma, childhood wounds, and unconscious beliefs about love and worthiness are projected. They represent an opportunity to finally win the love that was withheld in early relationships, to prove one's worthiness through persistence and devotion, to transform rejection into acceptance through enough effort and understanding. The intermittent reinforcement trap. The foundation of obsession with a harmful avoidant lies in the powerful psychological principle of intermittent reinforcement, where unpredictable rewards create stronger attachment than consistent ones. The avoidant's sporadic expressions of love, rare moments of vulnerability, and occasional displays of affection feel more significant and valuable than the consistent care offered by emotionally available partners. This scarcity creates artificial value that has nothing to do with the actual quality of what's being offered. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to pay more attention to uncertain outcomes than predictable ones, a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alert to potential threats and opportunities. In modern relationships, this mechanism misfires when applied to emotional unavailability, making the avoidant's inconsistent behavior feel more engaging and important than steady, reliable love. The obsessed person experiences a neurochemical high when the avoidant shows affection, one that's far more intense than the satisfaction of consistent emotional availability. This reinforcement pattern creates a psychological addiction where the person becomes dependent on the highs and lows of the avoidant's emotional availability rather than seeking the stability and security of healthy relationships. They begin to associate love with uncertainty, passion with pain, and significance with struggle. Relationships that offer consistency and emotional safety feel boring or insufficient in comparison to the intensity generated by the avoidant's unpredictable behavior. The intermittent reinforcement also prevents accurate assessment of the relationship's overall quality, because the rare positive moments overshadow the consistent negative patterns. The person focuses on the avoidant's potential rather than their demonstrated behavior, on exceptional moments rather than typical interactions, on what could be rather than what actually is. This selective attention maintains the obsession by filtering out evidence that contradicts the fantasy of eventual fulfillment. Unresolved attachment wounds. Obsession with a harmful avoidant often stems from unconscious attempts to resolve childhood attachment wounds through adult relationships. The person may have experienced inconsistent caregiving, emotional neglect, or conditional love during their formative years, creating unconscious beliefs that love must be earned through persistence, that emotional availability indicates lack of worth, and that struggle equals significance in relationships. The avoidance behavior recreates familiar childhood dynamics where love was uncertain, attention was scarce, and approval had to be earned through perfect behavior or exceptional effort. This familiarity feels like home to the wounded psyche, even when it's harmful and destructive. The person mistakes the activation of old trauma patterns for deep connection and meaningful love, not recognizing that they're simply replaying unresolved psychological dramas. These attachment wounds create unconscious beliefs that healthy, available partners must be flawed or unworthy because their consistent love doesn't match the person's internal programming about how relationships work. They've learned to associate love with anxiety, uncertainty, and the need to prove worthiness, making the avoidance behavior feel more authentic and significant than straightforward expressions of care and commitment. The obsession becomes an unconscious attempt to rewrite childhood experiences by finally winning the love of someone who initially rejects or withdraws from them. They believe that if they can transform the avoidance, emotional unavailability into commitment and love, they'll heal their early wounds and prove their fundamental worthiness. This fantasy drives the obsession long after a rational assessment would suggest moving on. The fantasy of transformation. A significant component of obsession with harmful avoidance involves the fantasy that patience, understanding, and unconditional love will eventually transform them into the ideal partner. This transformation fantasy allows the obsessed person to avoid accepting the reality of incompatibility while maintaining hope that their investment will eventually be rewarded. They become addicted to the potential they see in the avoidant rather than dealing with the person who actually exists. The transformation fantasy often includes detailed scenarios about how the avoidant will eventually recognize their worth, overcome their emotional limitations, and provide the love and commitment that was previously withheld. These fantasies feel more exciting and meaningful than the reality of building relationships with people who are already emotionally available and capable of commitment. The fantasy provides hope and purpose that can become more compelling than actual experience. This fantasy is often reinforced by popular culture narratives about love conquering all, patient partners being rewarded with transformation, and the romantic appeal of healing wounded souls through devotion. These cultural messages provide external validation for choices that are actually psychologically harmful, making the obsession feel noble and romantic rather than compulsive and self-destructive. The transformation fantasy also allows the obsessed person to avoid confronting their own role in choosing unavailable partners and their own need for healing and growth. By focusing on the avoidant's potential for change, they avoid examining their own patterns, wounds, and unconscious motivations that draw them to emotionally unavailable people repeatedly. The validation addiction. Obsession with a harmful avoidant often represents an addiction to the validation that comes from their rare expressions of care or attention. Because the avoidant is generally withholding and emotionally distant, their occasional acknowledgments feel extraordinarily significant and valuable. The person becomes dependent on these moments of validation while ignoring the consistent invalidation that characterizes the majority of their interactions. This validation addiction creates a cycle where the person's self-worth becomes dependent on the avoidant's approval and attention. They begin to measure their value through the avoidant's inconsistent responses rather than developing internal sources of self-esteem and validation. This external focus makes them vulnerable to manipulation and prevents the development of healthy self-regard that would make unavailable partners less appealing. The scarcity of validation from the avoidant makes it feel more precious and meaningful than consistent validation from available partners. The person begins to believe that easily given validation is less valuable than validation that must be earned through struggle and persistence. This distorted thinking prevents them from recognizing and appreciating genuine love when it's offered freely and consistently. The validation addiction also creates tolerance, where increasing amounts of attention and acknowledgement are needed to achieve the same emotional high. The person becomes progressively more willing to accept poor treatment in exchange for rare moments of positive attention, gradually lowering their standards and expectations while increasing their investment in someone who consistently demonstrates their unwillingness or inability to provide adequate emotional support. The trauma bond. The cycle of hurt and intermittent care created by harmful avoidance often produces trauma bonds that feel like deep love, but are actually psychological entrapment. These bonds form when someone experiences both harm and care from the same source, creating powerful attachment that's difficult to break despite obvious dysfunction. The person begins to associate love with pain, intensity with significance, and struggle with devotion. Trauma bonds create neurochemical addiction patterns that make leaving feel impossible despite rational awareness of the relationship's harmful nature. The person experiences withdrawal symptoms when separated from the avoidant, including anxiety, depression, obsessive thinking, and physical discomfort. These symptoms feel like evidence of deep love rather than recognizing them as signs of psychological dependence and trauma. The trauma bond also creates cognitive dissonance where the person must reconcile their love for someone who consistently hurts them. This often results in minimizing the harm, maximizing the positive moments, and creating elaborate explanations for the avoidance behavior that protect the attachment while ignoring reality. The person becomes invested in maintaining their version of the relationship rather than dealing with what actually exists. Breaking trauma bonds requires recognizing them as psychological entrapment rather than authentic love, understanding that the intensity of attachment doesn't indicate the health or value of the relationship. Recovery involves developing new neural pathways associated with safe, consistent love, while allowing the addictive patterns created by intermittent reinforcement to fade through non-use. The projection of unconscious needs. Obsession with a harmful avoidant often involves projecting unconscious needs, desires, and wounds onto someone who represents the opposite of what would actually fulfill those needs. The person sees in the avoidant what they need to see rather than who the avoidant actually is, creating a relationship with their projection rather than the real person. This projection maintains the obsession by ensuring that the avoidant always represents exactly what the person believes they need. These projections often include seeing depth, where there's shallowness, sensitivity, where there's callousness, potential where there's limitation, and love where there's indifference. The person creates an elaborate internal narrative about the avoidant's true nature, hidden feelings, and eventual availability that has little basis in observable reality. This narrative becomes more compelling than actual experience because it fulfills psychological needs that the real relationship cannot meet. The projection also includes attributing one's own capacity for love, empathy, and commitment to the avoidant, assuming they share similar feelings and motivations, despite evidence to the contrary. The person believes that because they care deeply, the avoidant must also care deeply, but simply struggle to express it. This assumption prevents accurate assessment of the avoidant's actual feelings and intentions. Recognizing and withdrawing these projections is essential for breaking the obsession and seeing the avoidant clearly. This process often reveals that the person was never actually obsessed with the avoidant themselves, but with their own projected needs and fantasies. The real avoidant, stripped of projections, often appears quite ordinary and unsuitable for the kind of relationship the person actually wants. The fear of settling. Many people remain obsessed with harmful avoidance because they fear that accepting love from available partners represents settling for less than they deserve. They've convinced themselves that the intensity and challenge of the avoidant relationship indicate its superior value and significance compared to easier, more straightforward connections. This fear prevents them from recognizing that what feels like settling is actually accepting healthy love and appropriate treatment. This fear often stems from cultural messages that equate ease with mediocrity, that suggest the best relationships require struggle and conquest, that love worth having must be difficult to obtain. These messages prevent recognition that healthy relationships feel easier because both people are contributing equally to connection and compatibility, not because the love is less valuable or significant. The fear of settling also reflects unconscious beliefs about personal worthiness and what kind of love is deserved. The person may believe that they don't deserve easy love and must earn it through struggle and persistence. They interpret the avoidance difficulty as evidence that this relationship is special and worth the extra effort, not recognizing that emotional availability should be a baseline requirement rather than an extraordinary gift. Overcoming this fear requires recognizing that accepting consistent, available love isn't settling, but making choices that actually serve one's emotional and psychological well-being. It means understanding that the right person won't require convincing to love and commit, that healthy relationships feel easier because both people are willing participants rather than one person pursuing while the other resists. The sunk cost fallacy. Obsession with harmful avoidance is often maintained by the sunk cost fallacy, where the amount of time, energy, and emotion already invested makes leaving feel like admitting failure or waste. The person believes that walking away means all their effort was meaningless, and that continuing might eventually produce the return on investment they've been seeking. This economic thinking applied to emotional relationships prevents recognition that continued investment in a failing situation only increases the eventual loss. The sunk cost mentality makes the obsession feel rational and justified, rather than recognizing it as throwing good emotional energy after bad. The person focuses on what they've already given rather than what they're likely to receive, on past investment rather than future potential, on avoiding loss rather than pursuing gain. This backward-looking perspective prevents forward movement and realistic assessment of actual possibilities. This fallacy also creates pressure to justify the obsession by eventually achieving the relationship success that would retroactively validate all the previous struggle and pain. The person becomes invested in proving that their choice to persist was correct, rather than accepting that some investments simply don't pay off regardless of how much effort is applied. Breaking free from the sunk cost fallacy requires recognizing that past investment doesn't obligate future investment, that walking away preserves whatever energy and emotion remain rather than losing everything. It means understanding that the lessons learned and growth achieved during the obsessive period have value regardless of whether the relationship succeeds, and that this value doesn't require staying in a harmful situation to be realized. The identity investment. For many people, obsession with a harmful avoidant becomes so central to their identity that letting go feels like losing themselves entirely. They've organized their self-concept around being the patient partner, the understanding lover, the person who sees potential where others see problems. Their identity becomes tied to their capacity for unconditional love and persistence in the face of difficulty, making the obsession feel like a core part of who they are. This identity investment makes the obsession feel noble and meaningful rather than compulsive and harmful. The person sees themselves as demonstrating exceptional loyalty, love, and understanding, rather than recognizing they're participating in psychological self-harm. They take pride in their ability to love someone difficult rather than questioning why they're attracted to difficulty in the first place. The identity investment also creates fear that letting go of the obsession means becoming someone lesser, less loving, less understanding, less capable of depth and commitment. The person believes that accepting easier love means compromising their capacity for extraordinary devotion, not recognizing that their devotion deserves to be directed towards someone capable of appreciation and reciprocation. Developing a new identity based on self-respect, healthy boundaries, and recognition of personal worth allows the person to maintain their capacity for deep love while directing it toward relationships that enhance rather than diminish their well-being. This identity shift requires recognizing that true strength lies in choosing what serves one's authentic needs rather than what feels familiar or challenging. Breaking the obsession. Breaking obsession with a harmful avoidant requires a multifaceted approach that addresses the psychological, emotional, and behavioral patterns that maintain the attachment. This includes going completely no contact to break the intermittent reinforcement cycle, working through underlying attachment wounds that make unavailable partners feel familiar, and developing new relationship patterns based on mutual respect and emotional availability. The process also involves grieving, not just the loss of the avoidant, but the loss of the fantasy relationship that never actually existed. This grief work allows the person to separate their legitimate emotional needs from their attachment to someone who cannot meet those needs. It involves accepting that some people are simply unable or unwilling to provide healthy love, regardless of how much they might be loved in return. Recovery requires developing new neural pathways associated with healthy relationships while allowing the addiction patterns created by intermittent reinforcement to fade through disuse. This involves consciously choosing to spend time with emotionally available people, engaging in activities that provide consistent satisfaction rather than intensity, and building self-worth through internal validation rather than external approval. Most importantly, breaking the obsession requires recognizing it as a symptom of unmet psychological needs rather than evidence of true love or deep connection. The obsession serves functions that have nothing to do with the avoidant's actual suitability as a partner and everything to do with unconscious attempts to heal wounds, prove worthiness, and recreate familiar relationship dynamics. Understanding these underlying motivations allows for more direct and effective approaches to meeting authentic needs, while protecting against future obsessions with unavailable partners. The goal isn't to stop caring about the avoidant or to become cynical about love, but to develop the capacity to distinguish between authentic connection and psychological entrapment, between love that serves growth and attachment that prevents it, between partners who enhance life and those who complicate it unnecessarily. This discernment allows for conscious choice in relationships rather than compulsive repetition of harmful patterns disguised as romantic devotion.